Get out of my house, crazy woman. These words keep ringing in my head like an ominous echo, beating off every corner of my mind, not allowing me to forget that moment. I'm sitting on the sidewalk, cold concrete touching my feet, and tears are constantly streaming down my face like rain. I can't hold them back, I can't find the strength to stop. In their mirrored surface, I see a reflection of what has become my life, empty, meaningless, destroyed. My hands are shaking, my fingers are tearing at the fabric of my dress, as if it's the only thing that can hold me back. I still feel a burning sensation in my shoulders, where his hands pushed me, and then, as if I wasn't anyone, he just threw me to the floor. That look, cold and inhuman as ice, that pierced right through me, leaving not the slightest trace of love. And so, at this moment, I realize, this is the end. It's my 61st birthday. The day that should have been mine. My holiday. My life. My son, Scott, condemned me to loneliness. He chose her, this woman I can't put up with. I look at the earth, at its cold stones, losing all understanding of how it happened that he, my son, now treats me like nothing. He thinks I'm nobody, just like she does. He destroyed what was most important to me. I've spent my life giving her everything I could. I loved him, raised him, was there for him, despite everything. I sacrificed for him. And now he's kicked me out. Like garbage. Like a thing that doesn't need a place anymore. And all because of her. With her soft whispers in my ear, with her look full of contempt, with her manipulations. I warned him. I begged him. Don't marry her, I shouted in his face, begging him to see what kind of person she was, what she was doing to him. But his eyes were full of blind passion, full of lust and hatred for me. He was blinded. Blinded by the fact that she's with him. Because he thought she loved him. But I knew. Women don't like it. They love themselves. And now, thanks to her, I have lost everything, my son, my grandchildren, my family. Everything I've been building all my life. I was thrown away as an unnecessary thing. I'm lying here on the sidewalk, surrounded by the wreckage of my heart and broken dreams. And so, at this moment, when I think it couldn't be worse, a car pulls up. I hear the window roll down and feel my best friend Sabrina's worried gaze on me. What the hell happened? What are you doing here? Her voice is full of anxiety and concern, as always. I can barely get the words out. Scott. He kicked me out. He said I was crazy and that this was his house now. Sabrina's eyes widen in shock, but then she narrows them, and a familiar anger appears on her face. Did he do it on your birthday? She gasps in disbelief. Oh, honey, get in the car. You're coming home with me. I get up, although every movement is difficult for me, and get into the passenger seat. My body is numb from shock, from pain, from all this terrible truth that can't seem to be real. Sabrina starts the car and starts driving. She keeps glancing at me, her gaze is frowning. She sees that I'm lost, that I can't pull myself together, and her words haunt me. This is unacceptable, and Scott cannot do this. This cannot remain without consequences. I shake my head sadly, barely holding back tears. What can I do, Sabrina? He's a grown man. He made his choice. Sabrina purses her lips, her gaze resolute as always when she makes a decision. Maybe he's an adult. But that doesn't mean he can get away with it. You're his mother, and it's time for him and that horrible wife of his to find out that their actions have consequences. I turned to Sabrina, confused, not understanding what she was saying. My thoughts were scattered, filled with pain and confusion, and it was difficult for me to understand her words. She noticed my gaze and, without taking her eyes off me, said slowly, almost with a grin. My dear, she paused so that I could catch the weight of her words. It's time for a little revenge. I froze, staring at her, trying to process what I had just heard. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was a warning. I felt something inside me begin to stir: uncertainty, fear, and at the same time something different. The revival. Hope. Hope that I haven't felt for so long, maybe too long. Oh, how I dreamed of seeing them pay for everything they did. I dreamed that Scott and Rachel would feel at least a small fraction of the pain they caused me. Maybe it's the karma that I've thought about so often that will finally come crashing down on them. The day started relatively calmly for me. Birthday. I tried not to let the shadow of destruction overshadow him, not to let what happened take over. My resolve held fast, like an invisible wall, shielding the gloom and disappointment from everyone. I wasn't going to give up. I spent the morning as usual, cleaning the house, decorating the rooms, cooking something special. There was already an old family cake on the table, the one Scott had always loved as a child. I went to the bakery and bought it, despite the fact that my heart was tormented by doubts. When I called Scott, I almost didn't believe he would answer. My heart skipped a beat when I heard his voice. He was wary, distant, but at least not as cold as the last time. When I suggested that he come with Rachel and the kids to dinner, for a moment it seemed to me that everything could return to its place. Everything that I had once seen so vividly seemed more achievable than ever. However, despite his agreement, everything was not as it should have been. I waited with tired eyes, reliving every moment, every movement in the room. When the long, awaited evening came, I managed to cook lasagna, his favorite, which, it would seem, should have reminded him of all those years when we were a family. The cake stood on the counter, like a symbol of something we once shared. Everything was ready. And so, when I heard the doorbell ring, my delight was so great that I literally jumped up to her. But as soon as I opened the door, something in my chest tightened heavily. I saw Scott standing in the doorway, frowning, with Rachel next to him. Her lips were twisted in mockery, as always, and the children were not visible. My heart froze. Where are they? I could barely get the words out. Where are the children? Rachel, standing a little to the side, burst out laughing. Her laughter was cold and penetrating like a knife. She stepped forward, looking down at me. We decided that it would be better if they did not come. We wouldn't want them to be exposed to your toxic influence. Her voice was as caustic as poison. I could feel her words stabbing into my chest like sharp arrows. Toxic effect. These words sounded like a blow in my head. Did I really become that kind of person for them? I stood there, not believing what I was hearing. My body was paralyzed, and my eyes filled with tears. I tried to maintain my dignity, but her look of contempt wouldn't let me. What are you talking about? I managed, feeling my lips tremble. I've always loved Scott. I've always been there for you. I've never done anything to hurt him. But Rachel wouldn't listen. Her eyes glittered with anger. She continued, more and more aggressively. Drop this act of martyrdom. You're just a selfish, vindictive woman who can't accept that Scott has moved on with his life. That he chose me over you. You've ruined everything. All you want is revenge, and you won't get it. Something inside me clicked. I felt like I was losing all ability to control myself. I wanted to explode, to get rid of this pain that was squeezing my chest. I rushed to her, not realizing what I was doing, ready to knock that smug grin off her face, but at that moment, Sabrina, who was standing a little to the side, silently watching the scene, took a step forward, putting her hand on my shoulder, stopping me. Her gaze was firm and calm, there was not the slightest doubt in it. But Scott stepped between us, his fingers digging into my wrist like an iron vice. His grip was painful, and I seemed to feel his anger permeate my skin, penetrating right into my bones. He growled, his eyes flashing with cold fire. Don't you dare touch my wife. I was taciturn, unable to contain the storm of emotions that surged through me. He was so confident in himself, in his power. He knew that I would not be able to answer him, I would not be able to resist. My lips were dry, and I could barely keep from crying. Scott continued. You're pathetic. You know you came up with this whole birthday deal, trying to get back into my life. But it won't work. We're done with you. With that, he pushed me back, and I lost my balance, stumbling. My body didn't seem to be able to control any movement. I clung to the door frame, trying not to fall, but even that didn't help. My soul was falling somewhere even deeper. Tears began to flow down my cheeks like rain, not noticing the barrier. I looked at Scott, pleading with his eyes, but he, standing with Rachel, just shook his head. His gaze was empty, cold as glass. Don't give me any more. Rachel, let go. His words fell on me like a heavy stone with every syllable he uttered. I watched helplessly as they turned and walked away, their figures slowly disappearing into the darkness of the evening air. And at that moment, the door that I had so joyfully opened a few hours ago slammed shut with a loud sound, echoing in the empty house. It was a sound that I will always remember, the sound of completeness, cool and ruthless. I was standing there, alone. On your birthday. My soul was shattered and my heart was broken into a million pieces. I couldn't understand how it happened, how I ended up here, in this empty house, in this empty world. A minute, another minute, the hours merged into one endless moment in which the pain seemed endless. I couldn't remember how much time had passed. Time has become alien. Only the pain remained. Finally, somehow calming down, I closed the door. My hand was shaking, and I could barely close it, leaving behind this world full of hatred and betrayal. I stumbled over the sofa, falling onto the pillows, and at that moment, the sobs I had been holding back until now burst out like a river breaking a dam. I was crying. I cried like I hadn't cried in a long time. How could he do this to me? How could my own son turn his back on me like I was nobody? I have devoted my whole life to him, to love and care. I didn't know what else I could have done to earn even a little bit of his understanding, his recognition. My thoughts were spinning in my head like a whirlwind. The ringing of the phone pulled me out of this endless whirlpool of despair. I looked at the screen. Sabrina. For a moment, I even thought about ignoring her call. I didn't want to burden her with my problems. I didn't want to show my weakness again. But the thought of being alone with it was unbearable. I answered, trying to keep my voice calm, but I couldn't hide the tears. Hello. I whispered, trying not to choke on the pain. Julia, what happened? Scott, him. Has he not arrived? I could hear the alarm in her voice, but she remained restrained, as always. And as soon as I started talking, all the pain, all the suffering, all that I was trying to hide, burst out. I spoke between sobs, between sighs, without trying to control my words. Sabrina was silent, just listening, and I felt her presence as something solid and reliable, like an island in the sea of my despair. Eventually, she spoke, her voice firm but with a note of concern. This has gone too far, Julia. Scott and Rachel can't keep treating you like nothing. It's time for them to face the consequences. I sobbed, wiping my eyes, trying to regain some clarity. What do you mean? I asked, not understanding. Sabrina paused, and I felt her confidence, her strength, like a magnet, pulling me towards her. Her words sounded like a command. I mean, it's time to pay up. They think they can step on you, but they have something else. You're a strong woman, Julia. It's time to behave like this. Her words, so simple but full of power, ignited a spark in me, a flash of anger amid the pain. She was right. I couldn't sit here smearing my tears and waiting for things to sort themselves out somehow. I had to act, to regain some control. Okay, I said firmly, my voice becoming resolute. Now what? I could almost hear Sabrina's smile on the other side of the line, her confidence like a bright beacon in the night. I'll meet you at the diner in an hour. I have someone I want you to meet. Trust me, he will help me a lot. An hour later, I was sitting across from Sabrina at a local diner. She had a mischievous glint in her eyes as she sipped her coffee, as if enjoying every moment, as if there was no room for doubt in her world. I, in turn, nervously toyed with the spoon and the cup, trying to figure out what she was up to. So who is this mysterious man? I asked, unable to stand the curiosity. Everything about this situation seemed so new and unusual. As if in answer to my question, the sound of a doorbell came from behind me. Sabrina waved, and I turned around. My eyes widened as a tall, broad-shouldered man approached our table. His expression was stern, like a man who had gone through a lot of hardships. Julia met my brother James, Sabrina said, gesturing for him to sit down. James nodded, and his gaze, intense and appraising, instantly swept over me, lingering for a moment, and then switched to Sabrina. His eyes became a little colder, as if he already knew something, as if something was alarming him in this meeting. I told her about your situation, James continued, leaning his elbows on the table. I am very sorry to hear about what your son and his wife have done. It's rude. I shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant, even as pain squeezed my insides, choking off my breathing. It was what it is. I had to live with that, but every time I thought about how Scott and Rachel had shamelessly betrayed me, I wanted to scream, to fight. But at some point I didn't know what to do or how to do it. But, James said, continuing, you seem to think I can help. I took a deep breath, feeling anxiety and a strange tingling sensation rise in my body. It was like that. I didn't know what to do. But something in his voice, in the confidence with which he spoke, made me believe for a moment that things could still change. James leaned his elbows on the table, leaning forward, and spoke like a man who was used to acting. In my work, I am a person who has seen a lot. I know that everyone has their own skeletons in the closet. And from what Sabrina told me, your sister-in-law has more than a few, to put it mildly. A tingle of anticipation ran down my spine, and despite the horror, I felt a spark ignite inside me. That was what I needed to hear. I couldn't believe that all my fears and doubts, all this destruction, could be used as a weapon. I've been speechless, broken and depressed for too long, now it's time for action. What are you saying? I managed, almost without realizing what I was saying. James smiled slowly, his smile dangerous, revealing a cold determination. I'm saying, let me dig into Rachel's past. If there's dirt to be found, I'll find it. And once we get that information, let's just say that karma has a way to get back to the starting position. I couldn't hide my reaction. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what James was suggesting. Could this really work? Can we make Scott and Rachel pay for what they did? Looking into James's confident eyes, I made a decision. I was ready to do anything to get back at least a little bit of justice. Great, he said, nodding with obvious satisfaction. Give me a week. I'll be in touch. When he got up to leave, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination, like a heavy wave rolling over me. It suddenly became clear to me that they thought they could break me. But they were wrong. I was ready to fight. The week crept by, and every day seemed like an eternity. I tried to occupy myself with anything so as not to think, but my thoughts kept returning to James and how he would look for information. It was hard for me to believe that someone like Rachel, with her ruthless determination, could hide such secrets, such dirty secrets. But maybe I was wrong. Perhaps everything was not as it seemed at first glance. Sabrina checked on me daily, offering words of encouragement and support. She was the only person who kept me sane, the only one who really understood the depth of my pain and anger. All I could do was hope that in this chaos, in this storm, I would be able to find at least some kind of salvation. Finally, on the 7th day, my phone rang. It was James. "Julia, it's me. I have something. Where can you meet me?" My heart jumped in my throat. I was ready. "Of course I'll be there," I said, unable to keep the excitement out of my voice. I arrived at James's office 10 minutes later, trying hard to calm my nerves. Sabrina was already there when I walked in. She was pacing around the small waiting area, clearly nervous. But when I came over, she hugged me tightly. Her support was the warmth that I missed so much. "Are you ready for this?" "What is it?" she asked, peering into my face. I nodded, furtively holding my breath. There was only one thought inside me: to be ready for anything. A few minutes later, James came out of his office. His face was gloomy, and there was a heavy tension on his shoulders. He came straight to us. "Come on, ladies," he said, motioning for her to sit down. We settled into chairs in front of his desk, and the air became thick with tension, as if we were all waiting for some terrible revelation. James opened the manila folder, spreading out the documents and photographs in front of us. I felt like everything inside me was shrinking, as if something important, intimate was about to become clear. "I did some digging into Rachel's biography," he began, continuing to turn over the papers, as if it was all for him, like solving some kind of puzzle. "And let me tell you, this woman is not a saint." He handed me the first document. Criminal record. Embezzlement from her previous job. She managed to avoid a prison sentence, but it was clear from the documentation that she had left behind a large trail of dishonesty. I looked at Rachel's picture, at her cold eyes, and I felt uneasy. It was her, no matter how many years had passed. "But that's not all," James continued, his voice becoming even more serious. "I also found out that she was interested in the death of her ex-boyfriend." My heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, everything I thought about Rachel seemed to take on darker shades. Sabrina gasped, and I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Bruised, I couldn't immediately find the words, but despite the trembling in my body, I squeezed out a question that came to naught. "What do you mean?" James silently handed me a newspaper clipping, and I almost choked. There was someone in the photo I didn't want to remember. The man whose gaze once burned in her eyes is Rachel's ex-boyfriend. Dead. Found under mysterious circumstances 3 years ago. There was a caption under the photo: "Unidentified body, police suspect foul play." I looked at James, trying to figure out what was going on, but my thoughts were still confused. "She was the last person to see him alive," James said calmly, watching my reaction. "This is not just a rumor." The police then suspected foul play, but could not prove anything. The words cut through my mind like a lightning bolt. The ground seemed to be slipping away from under my feet. Rachel, whom I thought was the perfect daughter-in-law, turned out to be so stained and dark that I almost vomited from the realization. It's the terrible truth. This is information about the woman my son married. I barely managed this question, turning to James, unable to hide my shock. "And what does that mean?" Sabrina interrupted me, equally shocked. James leaned back in his chair, clasping his fingers and looking at us thoughtfully. "It means we have leverage," he said, and there was confidence in his voice, as if this whole situation was just another game for him in which he knew the rules. "It means that if this information comes to light, her life, her reputation, her marriage, everything will be in jeopardy. She is well aware that this will put her life at risk." A flash of hope lit up in my chest, so strong that I almost cried out in relief. We could really regain control. We could do something. We weren't defenseless. "So what do we do now?" I asked, no longer hiding my excitement. A slow, dangerous smile spread across James's face, as if he was enjoying this moment, which was the culmination of his entire investigation. "Now we use it. We'll let Rachel know that we have this information, and if she doesn't want it to become public, she needs to convince Scott to fix things with you." Sabrina nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "And if she refuses?" "What is it?" she asked. "Then we're going to the police," James shrugged. "We'll let them reopen the investigation, and she'll unwittingly face the consequences of her actions." I sat stunned, trying to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Is it really that simple? Can I really make Rachel pay for everything she's done? For turning Scott against me, for all those little meannesses that resulted in a lot of pain? Looking at the determination on Sabrina and James' faces, I felt a surge of strength. They believed in me. They believed that I deserved justice, and for the first time since that terrible birthday, I believed it too. "Let's do this," I said, the firmness in my voice sounding like an inevitability. "Let him make them pay." James grinned, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Great," he said. "Give me a day to set things in motion. By this time tomorrow, Rachel won't know what's going to hit her." As we left the office, Sabrina squeezed my hand. "You're doing the right thing, Julia," she said, and there was so much confidence in her voice that I couldn't help but believe her. "Never doubt it." I squeezed her hand back, feeling purposeful and righteous anger. They chose the wrong woman to mess with. It's time for Rachel to learn this lesson the hard way. True to his word, James called me the next day. "Everything is ready," he said, and there was a note of satisfaction in his voice. I sent all the information to Rachel, along with a small message. We informed her that if she doesn't want this to become public, she needs to convince Scott to make peace with you. A mixture of excitement and nervousness gripped me. Can I believe it? Do you think this will work? I asked him, barely able to contain my anxiety. There's only one way to find out, James replied, but trust me, with the dirt we have on her, she'd be crazy if she didn't comply. I hung up the phone, and my thoughts swirled like an autumn wind. Is it true? Is Rachel really going to make a deal? Would she really get Scott to apologize and fix the situation? Part of me dared to hope, but another part whispered, it's too good to be true. Hours passed, but I still couldn't get an answer. I walked around the living room, jumping at every sound, convinced that it was either a doorbell or a phone call. But as evening approached, there was still nothing, and I was about to give up and go to bed. There was a knock on the door and my heart got stuck in my throat. It seems that the whole world froze at this moment. I walked slowly to the door, unable to breathe normally, and when I opened it, I saw him, Scott. He stood in the doorway, his face full of anger like never before, and something wild glittered in his eyes. "What the hell did you do?" He growled, not even giving me a chance to catch my breath, pushing past me into the house. I stumbled back, dumbfounded, before I could gather my thoughts. He was here, right in front of me, and his rage hit me like a hurricane. It's like a dark cloud ready to swallow up everything in its path. "What are you saying?" I could barely utter the words, staring at his face in confusion. I didn't understand what was going on. "Don't pretend to be a fool." His voice was getting louder, and his eyes were burning with such fire that I felt a chill run down my spine. "Rachel told me all about the private investigator, how you dug up her past, and you thought you could blackmail her to get me to forgive you?" Those words hit me like a hammer. I stood rooted to the spot, trying to process what Scott had just said. Does he really think that I could blackmail his wife, the mother of his children? I took a deep breath and lifted my chin. I couldn't let him humiliate me. "I didn't blackmail anyone," I said firmly, although my voice was trembling with excitement. "I just made it clear to her that her actions have consequences, that she can't just ruin my life and get away with it." Scott laughed harshly, as if I'd said something ridiculous. The chuckle was cold and ruthless. "Ruin your life? Are you serious?" He didn't even try to hide his contempt. "You are the one who is trying to destroy our marriage, our family, primarily with your constant feelings of guilt and manipulation. Anger swept over me like a storm. I couldn't stand still anymore, listen to his words, feel him accusing me of something I hadn't done. Rage boiled in my heart, and I felt my voice rising, becoming more and more tense. "I'm not the one who turned you against me, Scott," I almost screamed, but I controlled myself. "It was Rachel. She poisoned your life, and you don't see it. You don't see that she's a criminal, a liar, and maybe even a murderer." For a moment, his face froze. I saw his eyes widen in shock, and even he doubted his decision for a second. But it was only a moment. In the next second, his face turned hard again, and his eyes flashed with bitterness. "You're incredible," his voice was icy, and I felt how cold those words made me feel. "Do you really think I'm going to believe your crazy accusations about my own wife? The mother of my children?" I felt my heart tighten. He didn't believe me. He chose her. No matter how hard I tried to fight for the truth, he was still on her side. "These are not accusations, Scott," I clenched my fists, feeling the pain seep into every cell of my body. "These are facts. James found the evidence." But Scott just roared. "I don't care what your little detective friend found." He barked, and I saw his face contort with rage. "Rachel is my wife, and I trust her. I love her, and nothing you say or do will change." Tears instantly lit up in my eyes. They rushed out like a river, but I held them back, trying not to show my weakness. I couldn't let him see how much it hurt me. "That's it? Do you prefer her to me?" I tried to return his gaze, demanding an answer, but his face remained impassive. He clenched his jaw, and the words came out of his mouth with such fury that I felt them cut me. "You made that choice for me as soon as you decided to pull the stunt. I'm done with you, Mom. I'm done with your lies, your plans, all of this." His words were like a hammer blow. And so he, my son, walked away from me, turning to leave. At that moment, I felt something inside me crumbling, like the whole world was collapsing in one single gesture. His back was cold and receding, and I no longer knew how to get back. "Scott, please." I called him, but it was too late. He slammed the door shut, leaving me alone in an empty, quiet apartment. The panic and despair that swept over me tore everything inside. I couldn't lose him like that. Scott was gone, and I couldn't bring him back. What did I do wrong? Why didn't he believe me? I sank to the floor, sobbing coming out of my throat, and I couldn't stop. This shouldn't have happened. The truth was supposed to set me free, bring him back to me. Instead, she only pushed him further away. Suddenly the phone rang, and I jumped, almost bursting with excitement. It was James. I couldn't speak properly, my voice was hoarse and shaky, as if I was on the verge of fainting. "Julia, what happened? Did it work?" His voice was full of hope, but I couldn't answer without feeling the bitterness burning inside me. A bitter laugh escaped me, and I said, "No, it didn't work. Scott, he's gone. He chose her." A long pause. James was silent, and I could feel him processing information on the other end of the line, trying to figure out what to do next. And then his voice became firm, determined again. "Then we'll move on to Plan B. We'll go to the police and get them to reopen the investigation into Rachel's ex's death." I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "What's the point? It won't change anything. Scott made his choice." "It's not about Scott, Julia. It's about justice. We have to make sure that Rachel pays for what she did one way or another." I closed my eyes, feeling fatigue and grief overwhelm me, engulf me completely. Could I have done it? Could I really destroy my son's wife? The mother of my grandchildren? But then his face popped up in my head. Scott, with his cold eyes, with contempt and rage. And I remembered his smile, that smug grin with which he chose her over me. And I realized that they had brought this upon themselves. And now they will have to face the consequences. Okay, I whispered, as if giving myself permission for what I was about to do. A sharp feeling of new determination, like a cold metal object, hardened in my chest. It was so easy and hard at the same time to push away the fear and doubts that had plagued me all these days. Let's do it. Let's make her pay. The next few days were a blur of activity, as if I existed in some kind of half-dream. James and I have been collecting all the evidence he has gathered over these months of investigation, carefully organizing it into a neat package to be handed to the police. Sabrina was constantly present, offering support and encouragement when my resolve began to waver a little. She was my anchor, my comfort when I felt it was all too hard for me. But she was there, and it seemed to help me not to give up. Finally, that day came. We entered the police station, and the air around me was stretched like a string. I proudly raised my head, as if trying to break this whole system, which for years did not allow me to act. We came here to rip the lid off Rachel's dismantled past, and I was ready. The detective, tall and impassive, listened intently as we outlined our case. He furrowed his brows as he went through the documents and photographs, as if trying to grasp details that had not yet been there. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, a grim expression on his face. "These are serious things," he said finally, listening to the file. "If what you say is true, we have grounds to reopen the investigation." My heart took a deep, grateful leap. It's true. Every word I've said is confirmed. It has its price. I nodded, confirming it, despite all the doubts that were still dragging me down. Okay, then leave it with me. I'll take care of the case, the detective said with a hint of confidence in his voice. We left the station, and a wave of anticipation passed through my body, albeit with bitterness. I couldn't help but think about what was going to happen next. It was really happening. Rachel is finally going to meet music. 5 days have passed, and my phone suddenly rang. James, his voice full of triumph, sounded through the phone. "Turn on the news," he said, keeping a note of victory in his voice. I felt my heart speeding up its rhythm. I immediately turned on the TV, and the screen was filled with the face of the presenter. The news was important, and there was a serious expression on his face. "The latest news," the presenter said with a deadpan expression. "Local resident Rachel Michael has been arrested in connection with the previously unsolved death of her ex-boyfriend Andrew Huberman. New evidence has emerged prompting the police to reopen the investigation." I watched, mesmerized, as it all unfolded before my eyes. The cameras showed footage of Rachel being led out of her house, handcuffed. Her face was a mixture of shock and fear, as if she had suddenly found herself in a world that was completely alien to her. Scott followed her, his face dazed, having lost the confidence he had worn all these years. I felt a burning sense of satisfaction flare up in my chest. She finally got what she deserved. But my joy was short-lived. The next moment, the presenter continued. However, according to the latest information, Scott Michael had to use his savings to post bail for Rachel and hire a lawyer. This turned out to be a serious financial blow for the family, which will undoubtedly complicate their marriage. I could feel the air squeezing my chest. I should have felt guilty. All this is the result of my actions. I played my part in their difficulties. But instead of feeling guilty, I only thought about one thing: they rightfully brought this upon themselves. Their cruelty, their deception. It was all their own fault. Over the next few weeks, I watched the drama unfold. Rachel's arrest made headlines, and the court of public opinion was merciless. People talked about her crimes, how she manipulated, how she hid the truth. Scott, of course, tried to stand next to her, pretending that everything was fine. He stood with her in public, showing everyone that he supported her no matter what. But I saw how it came at a huge cost to him. He was looking at her, and I could see his heart breaking, his face contorting, as if he was forced to live in a world that no longer belonged to him. I felt relieved, but it wasn't complete. And one day, when I was returning from the grocery store, I noticed a familiar figure on the threshold of my house. It was Scott. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes were red from sleepless nights or from what he was going through in this world that was collapsing around him. For a moment, I considered ignoring him, pretending I wasn't home. But curiosity, that damn curiosity, got the better of me. I stepped to the door and asked coldly, "What do you want?" My hands were loaded with bags, and I felt how hard it became to breathe. Everything inside me was tense, and I didn't know what to expect from this meeting. Scott looked up at me, and his eyes reflected a mixture of fatigue, despair, and irritation. His face was contorted with pain, as if every word he was about to say was poisoned by his own realization of what had already happened. "Mom, I need your help," he said, his voice hoarse with inner tension. It wasn't just a request. It was the last hope, enclosed in a weak and painful word. I raised an eyebrow, feeling my heart tighten. "Oh, do you need my help now?" I asked, and there was a cold sarcasm in my voice. What happened to my plans? With what I should be doing? He flinched as if I had struck him. It wasn't physical, but inside it was the very moment when a person realizes that he is carrying all his pain alone. He closed his eyes as if trying to erase his words that had been said and that could not be taken back. I know. He said, "I've said terrible things, but this is more than that. You don't understand, Mom. Rachel has real problems. The evidence against her, it's bad." There were isolated, scattered thoughts in his voice that could not find a common direction. My fingers tightened around the door handle, and a moment of bewilderment flashed through my head. I frowned, not understanding what he was trying to say. But his face, it was like an empty vessel from which words poured out, unable to fill it with themselves anymore. "What are you saying?" My voice cracked with disbelief. Scott's voice became hoarse, barely audible. "I'm saying I don't know what to do. The lawyer's fees will bankrupt us, and if Rachel goes to jail, I won't be able to raise the children alone. I need you, Mom, please." He stood in front of me, his shoulders slumped, his eyes full of hopelessness that seemed unaffordable. I stood there, torn between the desire to comfort him and the hatred of his weakness, with which he had once turned away from me. He looked so broken, so defeated, and it was hard to understand at what point his life turned into this lump of pain. But then I remembered how he left me. I remembered his cruel words, those cold words he said when he left me alone. My body tensed, and suddenly, as if something inside me straightened my spine, my face became blank and hard. "You should have thought about it before you turned away from me," I said, my voice cold, without the slightest sign of regret. "I'm sorry, Scott, but you're on your own." I walked past him, not looking in his direction, not paying attention to his words and apologies. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. I wasn't going to be his savior, not after he chose his own path. A few days later, after Scott's desperate visit, I got a call. It was Rachel's mother. Her voice sounded strangled, subdued, as if she was trying to hold back the flood of emotions that was rushing at her. "Julia, I know we had our differences, but I need to ask a favor," she said, each word coming out with difficulty, as if she was trying to squeeze them out through the pain that was pressing on her chest. I felt a flicker of surprise. "What kind of service? What happened?" I asked, feeling a certain caution in my tone. "Children," she continued, and there was anxiety hidden in her voice. "With everything going on with Rachel's case, Scott is struggling to keep up. He needs a break. I was hoping you could take the kids for the weekend." I hesitated, not knowing what to do. On the one hand, the thought of spending time with my grandchildren filled me with longing. I haven't seen them for so long, But on the other hand, the idea of helping Scott and Rachel after all they had done to me was difficult to accept. And yet, despite the internal resistance, she continued to put pressure on me. Please, Julia, Rachel is pushing, and Scott is not coping. I know you love these kids. They need stability right now, and God knows they won't get it from Scott or Rachel. I sighed. Her words fell on me like a weight. She was right. My problems with their parents are my business. But the children, they are not to blame for what is happening around them. They deserved better than to be in the middle of this mess. Okay, I said, making a decision. I'll take them for the weekend. But I'm doing it for them, not for Scott. Of course, thank you. There was a note of gratitude in Julia's voice. I'll tell Scott to drop them off on Friday night. On Friday evening, as promised, Scott arrived at my doorstep. He looked even worse than the last time I saw him. His face was haggard and shadowed, as if he had stopped sleeping and taking care of himself a long time ago. Mom, he greeted me in a hoarse voice, thanks for that. I really appreciate it. I nodded tensely, paying attention to the children who were standing next to him. They looked at me with wide-open eyes, full of uncertainty and confusion. My little granddaughter, unable to stand it, burst into tears, and without hesitation, rushed to me, wrapping her small arms around my waist. I hugged her back, blinking back sudden tears. Hi, honey, I said, feeling the warmth of her body next to mine. I've missed you. My grandson was more reserved. He was standing next to Scott, nervously swinging the toy in his hands. I knelt down, opening my arms. Come here, buddy, I said, feeling the inner barrier begin to crumble. It's all right. Slowly he stepped into my arms, and as his small body shook with sobs, my heart ached for him. For both of them. For their helplessness, for the way they, in their smallness and innocence, were drawn into this endless circle of pain and despair that their own parents had built. I hugged my grandson tightly to me, feeling his small shoulders tremble, and gave him all the warmth and protection he needed. He was so fragile, so vulnerable. I could hardly hold back my own tears, realizing that, despite all my efforts, I could not completely protect him from what he was going through. It's going to be okay, I whispered, unable to say anything else, because I wasn't sure if I was telling the truth. My voice was trembling, but I tried not to show him my confusion. You're safe here with Grandma. Scott cleared his throat, interrupting this moment. His face was covered with tension, and a shadow of anxiety flashed in his eyes. I'll pick them up Sunday night, he said, his voice low and tired, as if he'd been through more than he should over the years. I straightened up, meeting his gaze. His eyes searched for sympathy, but I couldn't give him what he wanted. He had to solve his problems on his own. Without my help. I sighed bitterly, holding back my inner irritation. We'll be fine, I said coolly, knowing I wasn't going to give him any support. Enjoying the weekend. Scott nodded one last time and turned to the children. His eyes were looking for some kind of approval from me, but I wasn't going to give it to him. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared, leaving me alone with my grandchildren. When the door closed behind him, I felt how hard it became for me. But I forced myself to smile in order to distract the children from what they were going through, at least for a while. I knelt down and hugged my granddaughter. Who wants pizza for dinner? I asked, trying to dispel the anxiety that was thickly enveloping the air. The weekend was spent in a fog of laughter, games, and simple children's stories. All this fuss, their innocent questions and laughter filled the house with something bright, although I knew that this joy would be short-lived. At such moments, I could forget about all my personal troubles for a while, immerse myself in the pure joy of being able to be with them. But it was over too soon. When Scott returned to pick up the children on Sunday, his face was wary, as if he expected something worse. The children gathered their things in silence, their faces hidden under the weight of unnamed words, and I felt how hard it was for me to let them go. "Grandma, can we come to you again?" my granddaughter asked, her little hands reaching out to me as if she was trying to take something important and necessary. We had so much fun. I forced a smile and smoothed her hair, trying not to show how painful it was for me to let go of it. "Of course, dear," I replied, feeling my heart constrict. "Anytime you want." Scott's jaw clenched, and I felt the tension he carried permeate his entire body. He was on edge again. His face looked haggard, but his eyes were looking for only one thing: to control the situation. No attention to my feelings, to how I experienced this moment. "We have to go," he said, and there wasn't a drop of the gratitude I was looking for in his voice. It was an order. It was his usual manner. He was ready to take the children, but to leave me with this feeling of emptiness is not to care, not to ask, not to be interested. I froze, not knowing how to answer. Suddenly, something else flashed in Scott's eyes. Something that made me shudder. It was an angry dissatisfaction. "Goodbye." He did not raise his head, his words were fragmentary, without emotion. The children clung to me tightly, their little faces full of sadness. I stood and watched them climb into the car, ready to leave for their unknown world. How they are being left outside this house, and I remain in place, squeezing my heart. When the car disappeared around the bend, I felt a cold determination come over me. If Scott wanted to play hardball, then so be it. I wasn't going to play by his rules anymore. I've made my choice, and now it's time to end it. The day of the trial was cold and gray, the weather seemed to reflect everything that was coming. I wore a strict black suit. It was gloomy, but it radiated calmness and confidence. I felt how hard these steps were for me, but I was ready. Sabrina sat next to me in the car, her face full of determination. We were silent, but I felt how she supported me, how I supported her along the way. "Are you ready?" "What is it?" she asked as we drove up to the courthouse. I nodded, clenching my jaw. I've been ready for a long time. I had no choice. We met James on the steps and his expression was serious. "I have a surprise for you," he said, leading us inside. "I'm looking for Andrew Huberman's family. They're here to testify." These words made me feel an unexpected surge of gratitude. With this testimony, with this help, Rachel's fate could have been sealed. Everything that had happened so far was just a game that I wasn't going to continue. The courtroom was full of tense air. People were whispering, watching every move. I sat down at the prosecutor's desk, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched Rachel being led, her hands cuffed. Everything went quiet, and I suddenly realized that there was no going back. Shackled, Rachel looked pale and exhausted, but her eyes were still glittering with malice. They met mine, and for a moment it seemed to me that there was not just rage in her whole being, but a whole abyss from which she fed her hatred. Scott was sitting next to her, straining in his chair. He was like a sinister ghost, a masked face hiding conflicting emotions, eyes full of despair and anger, could find neither peace nor solace. I couldn't look at him anymore. The realization that he had become a part of this tragedy was hard and corrosive. I looked away to focus on the judge, who was bringing the end of this harrowing performance closer with every word. Everything was a blur, blurred and desperate. The trial had been going on for too long, and I felt the weight of these days, these weeks, these months weighing on me. We were all exhausted. The prosecutor detailed the evidence against Rachel, painting a picture of a cruel, calculating woman who would stop at nothing to achieve her goal. There was premeditation in her every act, manipulation in her every word, and now she was sitting in front of us, as unperturbed as a marble statue. But her eyes, they said much more than her calm face. However, it was the testimony of Andrew Huberman's family that really sealed her fate. His mother, a frail gray, Haired woman with hands trembling from the emotions she had experienced, spoke about her son's kind heart, his bright future, which Rachel coolly cut short. Her words sounded like songs about the untimely departed, and there was so much pain in every word that it seemed her heart was breaking right here in this hall. His sister, unable to hold back tears, talked about how Rachel had isolated Andrew from his loved ones all this time. She didn't give him any chance to return to his world. With every minute, with every word she said, Rachel became more and more a solitary figure, locked in her evil emptiness. She sat with a stony face, her eyes were cold and empty, like deep pools in which there is no life. Everything she had once been was gone in those eyes. She became just a mask. Scott was getting more and more worried. His knees were bouncing, his fingers were clenching into fists, as if trying to keep all his feelings from bursting out. Finally, the moment has come. The judge took the floor, and there was silence. Hundreds of eyes were directed at him, but I could no longer hear anyone but his voice. "We are about to reach a verdict," the judge said, his words as heavy as an old tree about to fall. "The jury has ruled in the case, the state versus Rachel Michael, on charges of first-degree murder." We all froze. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom was filled with sighs and the noise of muttering. The judge continued his speech, but I could no longer hear these words. I looked at Rachel, and her face became discolored. She couldn't believe it, as if everything that was happening was some kind of ominous dream that she couldn't wake up from. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Silence filled her whole being. Scott jumped up from his seat. His chair fell to the floor with a crash, and his voice broke through like a lightning bolt, breaking the silence. "No!" He was screaming, his voice full of despair and pain. "This is wrong. She's innocent." The judge raised his hand, calling for order. "Mr. Michael, pull yourself together, or I'll have you removed from the courtroom." Scott went quiet. His face turned as pale as paper, and his body collapsed back into place, as if all his strength had left him in an instant. He clutched his head in his hands, as if trying to collect his thoughts, his feelings, his heart, which, as it seemed to me, was about to burst out of his chest. Rachel, still sitting, turned to him. There was a desperate plea in her gaze, as if she was asking him for a miracle. "Scott, do something. You can't let them do this to me." Her words were quiet, but full of despair. Scott didn't answer. He sat staring into space, his shoulders shaking from the quiet sobs he was trying to hide. Bite then stepped forward, preparing to take Rachel away. I watched this process with a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside me. Triumph, yes, I felt it. But there was also some empty sadness associated with it, as if this moment of victory had been torn from the very heart of my life. My own son, Scott, had broken and humiliated his personal life, and now everything was in ruins. I was standing there in this room, and suddenly I realized that in this place where we were supposed to judge and punish, I also suffered my own price. When Rachel was escorted out, she turned away, her eyes met mine, and I suddenly felt something tighten in my chest. It wasn't a simple look. It was a look that hid all her hatred. The poison in her soul was unbearable, and she wasn't going to put up with it. "It's not over yet," she hissed at me, her voice low and deadly. "I'm going to make you pay for this. I swear it." I met her gaze firmly and without flinching. My answer was simple but decisive. "You've already paid, Rachel. You've made your choice, and now you're going to face the consequences. Goodbye." With that, I turned around and walked away without looking back. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, feeling all the weight I was carrying go away from inside me. It was all over. Justice had been served, but even when I was overcome with relief, I couldn't get rid of that lingering worry. Scott. His suffering face haunted me. Have I gone too far? Was I blinded by a thirst for revenge? Have I done any damage? I shook my head, dismissing my doubts. Scott chose his own path. He made his bed, and now he has to lie in it. He chose Rachel and turned away from me. Now he has to live with the consequences. I went outside in the cold weather, painting my day. My coat became tighter around me, as if protecting me from the cold wind, but I felt a strange emptiness in my soul. It's time to move on, to build a new life, my life, without Scott, without Rachel's toxic influence. A life that I will create myself.